Okay, so introduction to Project 2. This is an overview of setting up a file in Illustrator, some basics about the tools, and then I'm going to go into more detail about how to set up your process for like a simple illustration, relatively simple. It could be detailed. It could be whatever you want it to be. But one of the big differences between Illustrator and Photoshop is you really have to make a deliberate effort at organizing your process, uh, creating the layers, keeping control over how you build whatever the artwork is. Now, first of all, before you bring anything in that you might create artwork, vector work in Illustrator using an image that you already have, you should take a look at the image in Photoshop, and let's open an image that I just downloaded. I have a file here of a piece of old luggage. That's what I'm going to use to do a vector drawing. Just simple of a suitcase, let's say, as an example. I'm not actually going to draw a suitcase, but let's open that, and in a lot of cases, a ping as a file format is a good file format for an object with transparency around it. And there's a lot of ways you can do that if you don't have an image that already has transparency around it, clipping path, and so on. But we don't need to get into that right now. So, is there anything that you want to do in Photoshop? Because you're not actually going to bring this in, and I'll get into that. You're not going to actually embed it in Illustrator. You don't want to do Photoshop kind of functions in Illustrator. So, let's say we want to increase the contrast. Let's increase the contrast here. You always use legacy for contrast. It's a little bit easier. That might be easier to draw from. Okay. And then I'm going to click OK. Now, I'm going to save this in a new place. And what you should, especially with Illustrator, but this is true for a lot of programs. Okay. Let's save this file, do a save it as a new file. And what's important here is that very early on, you create a folder for this project that'll hold all the files related to the project, including your main working file. Presumably an Illustrator file. It's important that everything goes into this folder first before you do anything else in the other commands or operations that I'm going to show you. You want to have everything in the folder first. So I'm going to create a folder for Project 2. 217, and I'm going to put it on my SSD. Okay. And then we'll save this I really don't need it to be a ping, and I kind of prefer TIFFs. So you don't have to, but I'm going to change it to a TIFF and save. No compression. Yeah, that's okay. All right, now let's put Photoshop aside and go to Illustrator. Illustrator has a bit of a different interface, right? Illustrator is print oriented, which means the defaults are that it's going to go by points or inches in terms of your document size, not pixels, and that it's also generally the default is CMYK, not RGB. They're two very different color systems. CMYK is for print, RGB is for screen. And there's a lot of colors in RGB that are what we call out of gamut, that will not print, and you cannot create those same colors in CMYK. Okay? So, we're dealing with something that's tabloid size. So click on Create New, and that should give you a window something like this. Then click on Print. If it only shows you a few options, it may say see all options, and you want to click on that. Everything's in points right now. You may prefer it in inches. You're working 11 by 17, and that's what we call tabloid. Okay, so remember tabloid. If you don't know what tabloid is points wise, that's okay as long as you see tabloid. And we can change this to inches, and I'll show you in just a second how to do that. So, right here, points, pixels. We don't want pixels because, again, we're working towards print, right? We would use that in Photoshop. Here, let's say maybe points, maybe inches. Inches probably make the most sense. It's 8.5 by 11. We want tabloid, which is 11 by 17. Okay? It went back to points. We want it in inches, 11 by 17. Generally, for something like this, it would be vertical orientation. You could do horizontal. Bleeds. The bleed I will explain a little bit more, but basically, set your bleed, and this is kind of a minimum bleed, but set your bleed at 1/4 of an inch. And what that is kind of a border all the way around that if you're really getting a poster printed, it would be pretty important because it gives the printer a little bit of a margin for error when they're cutting, separating the prints, because they print on a big roll of paper. Color mode CMYK if you're working towards printing something, definitely. Raster effects. Well, I don't know. You might have something that you bring in from Photoshop and use just like it is. So your raster effects, you would want to show at print resolution, which is 300 pixels per inch. Preview mode default is fine. and then we hit create. Okay, now this is your artboard. If you haven't worked at all in Illustrator before, I hope you have, but this is your artboard. Basically, you can do things out here, on here. This is your page that will actually print. Here's your bleed, that little bit of space out there. And, all these tools, if you really want an in-depth, and I mean in-depth intro to Illustrator, I will give you tutorial URLs to get that. What I'm covering is going to be really basic and kind of directed more to just what we're doing, kind of the basics of what we're doing, what you'll need to know. You can branch out, and there might be things that you want to do specifically that a more in-depth tutorial would really be necessary. The first thing is right here. These are your tools. And one of the most important things here is that in Photoshop you had a foreground and a background color. In Illustrator, you have a fill color and a stroke color. So basically, this is the most basic, like, shape making tool, okay? And it is basically called the shape tool. So if I make a rectangle, okay, it's going to have white as a fill color and black as the stroke color. Let's change that. To change the fill color, I click on the fill color, bring it to the front. I want my color palette open. That's under Windows. And I'm just going to move this slider a bit. Get a bit of an orange, okay? Black is the stroke. And you can change the characteristics of the stroke depending on how you set up everything. You can have that up here in your main window, or you can open up stroke, that window. And we can go up in terms of the weight, the thickness of the line. So we're in the rectangle tool. Let's just make a rectangle. Here it is. Click and drag. Okay? What I want to point out is the basic components. This is kind of like the move tool in Photoshop. It's the general selection tool. This is the direct selection tool. You need two different selection tools because of how Illustrator operates. The general selection tool basically moves the whole shape. The direct selection tool, that's when you want only one particular thing, like an anchor point. And you can click on an anchor point, right? And move an individual anchor point, thereby changing the shape. Illustrator is basically vector drawing, and vector drawing is basically about anchor points and the paths that connect them. And I think I mentioned that kind of, in the first project in the course of talking about using vectors with type. So any of these can be manipulated. And in addition, you have a group selection tool, lasso tool. There's, just like Photoshop, a lot of tools. The pen tool is not what I call the freehand tool. That's the pencil tool. But the pen tool works with Bezier curves and straight lines. And a lot of people have trouble with the pen tool in the beginning, but it's really good to get used to. It creates anchor points. You click, there's an anchor point, okay? Your next anchor point is going to be wherever you click. If you just click, you have a straight line from one anchor point to the other. On the other hand, the pen tool, the main thing about it is the Bezier curve. And if you click and drag, you get a Bezier curve. And that's how people draw certain kinds of things that you can't do any other way. The Bezier curve, can be very exact with simple curves, things that long time ago people used to have to do with multitudes of French curves, which were, it was a lot harder. So anyway, the direction tool, the direct selection tool, then you can come back in and change a point or manipulate the curve. You can manipulate a curve here, pull it down, pull it up, and pull it this way and pull it that way. The Bezier curve tool or the pen tool is something that you have to get used to. It is really necessary for certain kinds of drawing. It's not necessary for this project, but we will be revisiting it and talking about it for another project. So let's go back to this. And again, it's important to point out here that you can start with a rectangle as a way of drawing. And if you click and hold on the anchor point tool, the pen tool, you will get the anchor point tool, which converts anchor points from corners to curves. So we can create all curves here. And then in addition to that, all right, you can also take the pen tool and add points. And then take the direct selection tool and manipulate a point. So the possibilities are kind of endless, even when you start with just a rectangle. You can start with a rectangle, you can start with any kind of shape and manipulate it, go from there, add points. You can also subtract points. Take the pen tool, hold down the Option key. Oops. Let's find a point. Yeah, actually don't hold down the Option key. I'm thinking of the way it was a few versions ago. And just click on it and it'll disappear. So, let's also look at stroke, and what if you don't want an outline? What if you don't want a stroke? Just click the none symbol right here, right there. So no stroke, right? Okay, and again, your fill color, you can change it any time. Anytime. And as long as this is selected, you'll be changing that. If I select that, I can change anything about that. All right. Now, another thing that's different is layers. Each one of these objects basically is a path. A shape is a closed path. we have a fill. So if you leave a path open and you have fill with the color in it, basically Illustrator's gonna fill it anyway. So let's say this is an open path right here, and it just connects the end point to the beginning point with a straight line. There's no path there yet. And to close the shape, I go back to the beginning point and close it. And there's a lot of ways that you can manipulate the simplest of shapes once you've started. A ton. So, again, this is the general selection tool, allows you to select one object, or you can group objects just by holding down the shift key. Now I've selected all three of these, and I can go to object group. Remember that these are independent objects though. It's not like in Photoshop where things just kind of on their own take their place as a layer. Nothing will. If I didn't do anything really to change this, besides when I bring in an image from Photoshop or something like that, everything will be on the same layer. And I'm going to show you how to organize a drawing, create layers, keep things organized so that you have choices and you can make decisions as you build things. Okay, so I'm going to just delete these real quick. And I'm going to go over this again, but I want to show you what to do if you're going to draw from an image. Go to File, and let's say you're going to use that suitcase image to draw an image of the suitcase. You go to File, Place. Now what you're doing in this case is you're not actually embedding the Photoshop file or the TIFF file in the Illustrator file. By placing it, you're creating a link from that raster file to this Illustrator file. That link keeps the pixels from being embedded in the Illustrator document, which is good because Illustrator isn't really built for pixels. I mean, you can put them in there, but eventually it'll slow Illustrator down. And again, it's a vector program. It's not a raster program. So, one of the things you want to make sure of when you open this is show import options, or you can click options there. And it should show the template box, okay? Template is really important because that, again, allows you to see the image when you're working on an Illustrator file. It's grayed out because I haven't selected anything. I'm going to go to this. Look for, what did I call it again? Project 2. Yeah, well, that makes sense. Okay. So here's the TIFF. You can see now the template box is there. That's really important. Don't miss this step. You want to check the template box. Okay? And the link should be already checked since you're placing it. And that's why it's also important to keep everything in one folder, right? And whenever you move the project from one place to another, if you need to, you move the whole folder. Okay? You can always export PDFs that have everything in them But that's not for working. The working file, again, you need to keep those links intact. So make sure you place the file first of all and check the template box second. And I'm going to go over this again too. Okay, and we place. So we got a big suitcase which we can scale down. Just going to hold the shift key, and this is basically what you get as a free transform box. Oh, you know, I did forget. Templates always come in on the very bottom as their own layer and locked. They're their own layer. They're a non-printable layer, which is part of what a template is. I'm going to select this. This is basically a free transform box. I'm going to hold down the shift key and scale it down. Okay. All right. So you can use photographic images in your poster work. You don't have to do drawings. The advantage of, you know, making something into a vector work is that vectors are scalable, and you can make it any size you want to. It doesn't change the quality. It's also a little bit easier if you're working with vectors, maybe to integrate everything, to change the colors, you know. And, you know, again, I really want to encourage you to kind of try and work with vectors as much as you can. But I'm also leaving it open that you can use photographs if you want to in these posters. So let's look at the other thing that's key here. And again, this is a template, so this is non-printable. I would have to do a drawing here because this is not something that would print. Okay, and the reason why we bring it in as a template is when you're drawing, and let's say you do, let's say you do a background shape, you know, we don't want that to be on the template layer. So let's undo the rectangle. We want to lock the template layer after we've done whatever we're doing. Go back to layer 1, and let's say I'm making a base color, background color. It should go all the way through all of your bleeds. That's the idea of having the bleeds there. Okay, now, if we want to trace that suitcase, the problem is we can't see it through the color. So you can turn layers off, but that becomes a hassle the more layers that you have. In Illustrator, there's different views. You can go to outline view, just see the outlines of what's there. So in other words, the color fills won't show up. The printable parts of the files won't show up, but a template will. So what that means is I could create a new layer, you know, and this specifically could be part of the suitcase drawing, or, you know, a very simple suitcase drawing that I would do, you know, on a separate layer. Again, I have my template below to draw from, and I can go back and forth from preview to outline. So I can draw from that image. Now, you may be asking, suppose I do want to use the photograph. I don't just want to draw from it. What would I do differently? Well, that's really simple. Let's go back to preview and we'll go to place. You still place it. Okay. Click on this. You just do not check the template box. You still need the link. And you just hit place. And it's also going to let you place where it is. And again, we would need to free transform it and so on. This is going to come in and it doesn't create a layer. Again, it's going to come in and basically sit itself on whatever layer you are on. So, unlike Photoshop, even when you bring an image in and you're placing it, it's not going to create a layer for you. Okay? Now, this is the good thing about pings, is pings, you know, it's easier, and people have gotten used to using pings for the transparent background, and then when you bring an image into something like Illustrator, it's already got basically what we call a clipping path around it to keep that transparency. So let's look at the type tool quickly. The type tool, it works because it's PostScript. It's very similar to the way things work in Photoshop. The difference is you can you can draw your box with all your type, and this is just dummy type. Here is the type window, which you can look at character, paragraph, so on. So we can change the size. Let's go way up to 48. And I'm just going to type in death of a salesman. You might have guessed that. And go through our fonts and so on. You know the drill. But once we do this is flexible. This shape, whatever you type in it, and you can go back to this just by selecting it and reformat it as many times as you want to. Now, there are options with type, other things that you can do. Let's select this type though, and what I'm going to do is, while it's selected, I'm going to go back to the type tool. We'll highlight it. All right. Once it's highlighted, you can change the color of the type. Let's again go up in terms of point size a little bit. All right. Let's change this to, something different. And basically, this is a type block. Like I said, you can manipulate in a lot of different ways. The type itself you can manipulate in a lot of different ways. And we will get a lot further into what you can do with type, specifically type and Illustrator, because there is so much flexibility. Now, remember that we talked about in Photoshop, we talked about layer styles. And there's something very, very similar in Illustrator. Those are certain effects, and they're on the top here. And many of these effects you can use and still keep the type formatable. So in other words, if we want to do a drop shadow, right? And let's preview it. Hold on. First of all, we have to have this selected. Let's go to Stylize, Drop Shadow, preview it, and click OK, and there you have a drop shadow. So those effects are a lot like layer style, the same kind of effects in Photoshop that you can do on a formatable type. So we'll keep that in mind. There's, as I said, a lot you can do with type in Illustrator. Putting it on a vector, putting it into shapes. We're going to get into all of that. For right now, we're just going to keep it really basic and focus on how to build, whether it's a complicated or a very simple drawing, how to build a drawing with a few colors and keeping it organized. And since I'm using this for two different classes, it won't be a suitcase. It'll be part of a face, but the same thing would apply if you're doing a suitcase. All the same rules would apply.